Hi, I'm Stephen Farram. I'm a senior lecturer in history and I want to talk to you about cyclones. A few hundred metres off Darwin's Casuarina beach lies Old Man Rock, a feature clearly visible at low tide. To the local Larrakia people, this is a sacred site. The Old Man, the Riba Nogalinya, is a protector ancestral spirit who is also responsible for much natural phenomena, including cyclones. While we tend to think of cyclones as negative events, the Indigenous viewpoint acknowledges they are also creative and facilitate renewal. Nevertheless, cyclones are dangerous things, and Aboriginal people know it is best to get out of their way. People who have retained traditional knowledge can warn of their arrival by studying the activities of creatures such as ants, reptiles and birds. Cyclone Tracy, which struck Darwin in the early hours of Christmas Day 1974, is arguably the most famous cyclone ever recorded in Australia. It was massively destructive, as I will describe later. Some people say Tracy was caused by Darwin University, who was displeased with developments around Darwin. Others say it is best not to talk about such things. While cyclones have been a feature of life in North Australia for thousands of years, the first European record of a tropical cyclone was not made until 1839. The venue was Victoria Settlement at Port Essington in the Northern Territory, which was almost completely wiped off the map when it was barely 1 year old. The small and isolated settlement had experienced rainy and stormy conditions for some days without much concern. But on the 25th of November, the barometer showed a marked drop in atmospheric pressure, which is a sign of changeable weather. Wild winds that night resulted in most buildings being unroofed or demolished outright. The gardens were left in ruins, the pier was destroyed, and Government House was lifted off its piers and dumped on the ground 3 or 4 metres away. Of 20 small boats on the water, only 2 survived. There were also 2 larger vessels, Britomart and Polaris. Britomart managed to ride out the storm, but Polaris was driven onto the beach and was forced onto its side, buried into 3 metres of mud. The bodies of 8 men missing from Polaris were discovered and buried over the following days. Everything movable was taken from Polaris to make her light enough to be put right, but it eventually took 3 months. The devastation in Victoria was matched in the surrounding countryside, where a track of fallen trees over 10 kilometres wide was discovered. No further cyclones affected Victoria before it was abandoned in 1849. In 1869, a more enduring settlement was made at Darwin, when the Northern Territory was essentially a sub-colony of South Australia. The SS Gothenburg was contracted by the South Australian government to run from Adelaide to Darwin via the east coast. On one home journey in February 1875, the ship was struck by a cyclone near the Barrier Reef and sank. Many of Darwin's leading citizens were drowned, with 102 lives lost in all, a full 1/7 of the territory's European population. The first cyclone to affect Darwin occurred in 1882, but damage was slight. The first big cyclone was in January 1897. Most of the flimsily constructed dwellings in Chinatown were demolished, with only 6 of the estimated 200 buildings left standing. Even most of the strongest stone buildings in the town lost their roofs or suffered structural damage. The worst damage perhaps was suffered by the pearling fleet, with 18 of the 29 luggers wrecked. 10 men from the fleet were killed, out of a total death toll of 28. Despite the great destruction, the town soon bounced back, with rebuilding well underway by mid-February, although it seems that very little thought was given to the safeguards needed against future cyclones. In the first decades of the new century, several cyclones passed near Darwin, damaging housing and creating havoc with shipping. In 1923, a cyclone in the Gulf of Carpentaria seems to have sunk the coastal steamer Douglas Mawson, with none of its 20 passengers and crew ever seen again. In 1924, Douglas Mawson was in the news again after some of its wreckage was found in Arnhem Land. A sensational story then emerged that survivors from the steamer had made it to the shore, but the men had been killed by Aborigines, who were now holding captive 2 white women. The story spread around the nation, and the government was virtually forced to send a rescue party, but no women were ever found. In 1937, the rumours began again, but tensions eased after anthropologist Douglas Mawson asserted that he had crossed the area concerned over several years and could say with certainty that there were no captive women. The whole story is a classic illustration of moral panic and the mistrust of Aborigines held by many white people at the time. In March 1937, a cyclone struck Darwin of sufficient intensity to damage nearly every building in the town, with many destroyed completely. The damage may not have been so great if more precaution had been taken in the rebuilding since 1897. But for most people, that was either a dim memory or something they knew nothing about at all. Then, as now, much of the population was transient and had little experience of tropical conditions. 1948 was a big year for cyclones in the top end, with 4 separate systems causing great damage in Borroloola, Vanderlyn Island, the Tiwi Islands and Darwin. And Arnhem Land and Barkly Tableland were under flood waters. In 1957, a cyclone dropped enough water into the catchment of the Catherine River to result in a record flood through the town of the same name. In the following 2 decades, scores of cyclones formed in territory waters, but most caused little damage. Some people suspected that another big one must be due, and it finally arrived in late 1974. But before we look at that, it is good to get an idea of how people's awareness of cyclones had been enhanced over the years. The first weather records from the Northern Territory were created by officers of the Overland Telegraph Service. In 1908, the Bureau of Meteorology was established, and with the arrival of radio in the 1920s, isolated coastal communities could send information to enhance the overall weather picture and receive weather forecasts in return. In 1958, a weather radar station was established in Darwin, but the big breakthrough was satellite tracking of cyclones, which became available in Darwin from the late 1960s. It was now possible to give accurate warnings of the intensity, location and direction of cyclones. In 1964, another innovation was the allocation of names to tropical cyclones, and until 1975 these were exclusively female. Between 1964 and 1974, the Bureau named 25 cyclones in territory waters. Some caused severe local damage, but none caused anything more than some heavy rain in Darwin. In early December 1974, Cyclone Selma formed in the Timor Sea and moved towards Darwin. But as it grew in intensity and was only 50 kilometres from the town, it stopped and veered away to the south. Later that month, Cyclone Tracy formed in the Arafura Sea and was also heading towards Darwin. On Christmas Eve, a warning was issued that very destructive winds were expected in Darwin that night and the next day, Christmas Day. But it seems that most Darwin residents had grown complacent over the years about the threat of cyclones. This was no doubt exacerbated by the false alarm over Selma. The result was that many people did not take the warning seriously. It is not necessary to recount here all the details of Cyclone Tracy, as it is a well-known story. Suffice to say that it is the greatest natural disaster ever to have occurred in Australia in terms of the property damage caused. Over 70 people were killed, but over 10,000 homes were left in ruins or completely destroyed. Once the rest of Australia knew what had happened, a massive evacuation of over 30,000 people was organised, as it was feared that the complete destruction of sanitation facilities could give rise to outbreaks of serious disease. This was apart from the fact that there was almost no housing or any other facility available either. Shortly before Tracy, the Institution of Engineers suggested that many of the buildings in Darwin were not sufficiently robust to withstand cyclonic winds. Unfortunately, their prediction proved to be all too true, and the newly built northern suburbs seem to have been the least well built, as they were almost completely flattened. After it was decided to rebuild Darwin, stringent new building codes were introduced. At first these were exaggerated to the point that the buildings were more like fortresses or bomb shelters than tropical houses. But it was soon realised that buildings could be sufficiently strengthened without going to such extremes. Darwin was not visited by another major cyclone for many years after Cyclone Tracy, and some fear that the population may be growing complacent again. In early 2011, Cyclone Carlos dumped massive amounts of rain on Darwin and other areas, and hundreds of trees collapsed due to the high winds and inundated soils. A few houses and cars were crushed. The damage was not massive, but the potential was there. Rather belatedly, trees such as the huge African mahogany, which is notoriously unstable in Darwin's shallow soils, were removed from many urban areas after Carlos. There can always be more done in preparation, especially knowing that Darwin was once again overdue for a big one. The big one turned out to be Cyclone Marcos, which struck Darwin on the 17th of March 2018. With winds of over 130 km per hour, over 400 power lines were brought down during the storm, leaving over 26,000 homes without power. Many people had no power for days, and several were left without electricity for well over a week. Thousands of trees were blown down and caused damage to cars, fences and buildings. Miraculously, no one was reported to have been killed or even seriously injured. This was partly due to the improvement in building standards since Cyclone Tracy, but it was also partly luck. Cyclones are a natural feature of life in North Australia. While most examples I've spoken on affected the top end of the Northern Territory, cyclones appear yearly in northwest Western Australia and northern Queensland as well. However, cyclones are not so common in nearby Indonesia or Timor-Leste, although they can occur there also. Further to the north, in the lands facing the South China Sea, such as the Philippines, destructive winds known as typhoons are a regular occurrence. Typhoons, hurricanes and cyclones are just local designations for the same thing. They can all be deadly, so if you find yourself in the region during cyclone season, listen to the warnings and take appropriate action.